Good morning, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I am Priya Karsachdev and I will be your MC for today. Please be reminded to turn off or switch to silent mode your mobile units during today's proceedings. We thank you for your kind cooperation. Tan Sri Dr. Rebecca Fatima Star Maria, Board Member of Ideas Malaysia. Esteemed speakers, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Selamat pagi and a very good morning. Welcome to the ASEAN Integration Report 2025 Report Launch and Public Forum. On behalf of Ideas Malaysia, we would like to express our gratitude to our partner, the Frederick Norman Foundation, FNF, for their support towards this project. Without further ado, to begin today's event, may I please have the pleasure of inviting Tan Sri Dr. Rebecca Fatima Star Maria, Board Member of Ideas Malaysia, to deliver the welcoming remarks.
Good morning, friends, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the launch of the 10th ASEAN Integration Report under the ASEAN Prosperity Initiative. This report series, led by Ideas, with the support of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation, has grown over 8 years into a vital resource for understanding ASEAN's economic integration. This latest edition focuses on regulatory and digital challenges in the food and beverage sector, especially their impact on MSMEs, and offers practical policy recommendations. At the heart of this work is inclusive trade, ensuring that the benefits of integration are shared broadly, empowering women, youth, and MSMEs to participate meaningfully in regional value and supply chains. I'd like to briefly reflect on two key themes. One is ASEAN's response to the changing global trade landscape, and pretty much related to that, the work of the ASEAN Geoeconomics Task Force, the report of which was recently launched. The soft launch was held in Manila a few days ago. ASEAN was born in a time of geopolitical uncertainty, and today that spirit of resilience is tested again. ASEAN has proven its resilience time and time again, from the Asian financial crisis of the 1990s to the global disruption of the COVID-19 pandemic. Malaysia began its leadership of ASEAN this year as we witness a world increasingly defined by coercion and fragmentation, with the erosion of the rules-based order turning trade into a weapon of influence. Yet, under Malaysia's chairmanship, we've made significant progress anchored in inclusivity and sustainability. Allow me to highlight some of the successes, the priority economic deliverables this year. We had the first ASEAN GCC summit, the first ASEAN GCC China summit. These two summits are important as Malaysia and ASEAN work towards diversifying their economies. We also had the upgrades of the ASEAN Trade in Goods Agreement and the third iteration of the ASEAN-China FTA, which included new areas such as digital trade, green economy, as well as supply chains. Another sort of success, if you wish, is the substantial conclusion of the Digital Economy Framework Agreement, We also saw the adoption of the ASEAN Sustainable Investment Guidelines and Semiconductor Supply Chain Framework. These are indeed commendable, but I want to draw your attention to three strategic milestones this year. One is the prompt establishment of the ASEAN Geoeconomics Task Force. Second, the first joint meeting of the ASEAN Foreign and Trade Ministers in 20 years. And third, the RCP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Leaders Meeting. These three signal ASEAN's readiness to adapt as economic and security concerns increasingly intersect. Let me take a few minutes to highlight the work of the ASEAN Geoeconomics Task Force, the AGTF. Recognizing the complex interplay between economic and security concerns in the current global landscape, the ASEAN economic ministers took a significant step by establishing the ASEAN Geoeconomics Task Force. This comprises policymakers and representatives from leading think tanks across the region. The task force was specifically designed to support a deliberate, evidence-based approach to regional challenges. The AGTF's focus underscores the necessity for ASEAN to accelerate regional integration and assume a more assertive role in shaping the rules of regional and global trade. Recognizing the interconnectedness of economic and security concerns, the task force presented its recommendation for coordinated action to both ASEAN economic and foreign ministers at their joint meeting in October, on the sidelines of the ASEAN summit. The AGTF recommendations covered managing short-term risks. This included dealing with illegal transshipments, how do you define transshipments, rules of origin, the spillover effects and contagion from the US tariff action, and also manage trade diversion risks. Second, deepening economic integration and resilience through prioritizing the ease of doing business. ASEAN realized that we have to intensify efforts to eliminate non-tariff barriers and establish a more robust mechanism for scrutinizing non-tariff measures. To its credit, ASEAN has already taken some meaningful steps, such as harmonizing product standards, recognizing conformity assessments, simplifying customs procedures, and aligning sanitary and phytosanitary standards. These efforts must continue with greater urgency and coordination. And the third area was on reinforcing multilateralism, repurpose ASEAN mechanisms, strengthening cross-pillar collaboration, strengthening the ASEAN Secretariat, monitoring the effectiveness of ASEAN agreements and initiatives. It's often said that we have loads in ASEAN, lots of blueprints, work plans, strategic plans. The real issue is implementation, and not just implementation, but effective implementation and analyzing the impact of these various plans and blueprints. Through stakeholder engagement, the AGTF, the task force, gathered feedback from the private sector. The message to us was clear. Most businesses plan to continue investing in the region, but to do so, they need governments to deliver on 5 key fronts. Streamline rules of origin, focus on trade facilitation, implement existing commitments, enable the movement of labor and skills, coordinate industrial policies, particularly through the ASEAN Investment Facilitation Framework and the ASEAN Services Facilitation Framework. Now, for me, the points raised by the private sector is nothing new. We've heard it over and over again. So what we did in the task force was to reinforce this, to ensure that now it's there. The engagement with the private sector must continue. And I must say that this year, the private sector, the ASEAN Business Advisory Council, came up with 2 very important initiatives. One is the ASEAN Business Entity, which should, if an entity is if an ASEAN business is granted the status of the ASEAN business entity, then that particular business or that particular corporation should be able to have movement, facilitated movement of skills intercompany, so intra-corporate transfers, as it were. So that was one, I thought, an important way the private sector is leading that process, working with governments. The second one that they did was the ASEAN Supply Chains Coordination Council. Now this, and our representative from the Federation of Malaysian Manufacturers is here. Shamini, where you put up your hand? There you go. Yeah. So this is, again, another private sector-driven initiative. And very importantly, this initiative, Shamini, if it takes off, would really facilitate inter-ASEAN trade, because what the business side's doing is that it's easy to talk about supply chains, but what supply chains? So as a start, they're looking at two sectors. One, textiles, and another will be E&E. Now, it's important, this is a deliberate selection of the two sectors. Textiles impact one segment of ASEAN, a set of ASEAN member states, and E&E affect another set of ASEAN member states. So what they're doing in that process is to have a dashboard, among other things, a dashboard of suppliers along the chain, so that we encourage then sourcing from within ASEAN, thus leading to intra-ASEAN trade and investment, for that matter. So these are two very important initiatives that have come out this year from the ASEAN Business Advisory Council, which is chaired by Malaysia. Okay. So that's to give you some examples of what we've achieved this year. Now, businesses, again, constantly emphasize that policy certainty and administrative simplicity matter more than incentives. So the ASEAN integration report that's going to be launched will highlight the regulatory bottlenecks and emerging challenges that we must tackle together. The AGTF also called for fast-tracking of the regional comprehensive economic partnership implementation to ensure that ASEAN remains a hub of openness, resilience, and economic security. As ASEAN upgrades its FTAs with its dialogue partners, it must ensure that RCEP stays relevant and is upgraded accordingly. Now, RCEP's basis was the integration of the rules of origin across the ASEAN plus one FTAs. So understandably, if you upgrade your ASEAN plus one FTAs, you must accordingly upgrade RCEP. So RCEP cannot stand still as you upgrade the others, because that's the basis of that agreement. So that's one of the things that during the leaders' meeting that was emphasized. The task force also reiterated the point that ASEAN's vision is sound, its plans are ambitious, but without timely execution, stakeholder engagement, and rigorous monitoring, even the best of policies will falter. So as Malaysia wraps up its ASEAN chairmanship, it's a good time, a good moment to reflect on how far we've come and where we need to go to deliver both efficiency and equity. We now pass the baton to the Philippines, whose leadership will carry forward the spirit of cooperation and drive ASEAN's next chapter of growth and inclusion. And for your information, the Philippines will be taking forward the recommendations of the AGTF. They just had their meeting early this week, where they discussed in detail how to implement those recommendations. So I'm very hopeful. I have always been an ASEAN person, always very optimistic about ASEAN despite its challenges. And I'm very confident that under the Philippines leadership, we will see continuation of an implementation of some of the recommendations of the ASEAN Geo-Economics Task Force. So I thank you all for making the time to be here this morning. I also want to thank the IDEAS team for burning the midnight candle, I'm told, to get this report out today. And thank you so much again for spending your time with us, the speakers, again, for making time to share your thoughts and ideas with us. I hope today's discussion will inspire fresh ideas and concrete steps towards a more inclusive and resilient, and as they say, future-ready ASEAN. Thank you very much.
Testing. Thank you, Tan Sri Dr. Rebecca, for the welcoming remarks. Now, I would like to invite Sharmila Suntarasegaran, Assistant Manager of Ideas Malaysia, to present the report. Sharmila, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Priya. Good morning, and thanks again, everyone, for joining us today for the launch of our 10th edition of the ASEAN Integration Report. If I can get the mic to work. Okay. Yeah, so our report is up there, so if you want to scan and download it as well, so you can have access to it while I go through the presentation. So the research that we published today sort of builds on a report that we published last year, particularly looking at the participation of smaller businesses or MSMEs in trade. As we all know, MSMEs remain underrepresented in cross-border trade, and although they make up a majority of enterprises, they also face the same trade policy environment as larger firms, but they have much less resources to navigate them. Our work mainly focused on the food and beverage sector for a few reasons. First, it's one of the most important sectors for regional trade and a huge source of employment with a lot of MSMEs in it. But it's also one of the most heavily regulated sectors for very good reason. Food regulation exists to protect customers, to ensure public health, and also to build trust in both domestic and also export markets. So what we wanted to unpack here is a bit different. Not whether regulations are necessary, because it absolutely is, but rather how these systems can work better for smaller businesses, where the main bottlenecks are within the region from perspective of MSMEs, and which processes could be simplified to better align across the region. That was sort of what we were looking at with this research. So to start, I just wanted to take a step back and look at the broader trade environment, because what's happening globally really shapes how ASEAN economies and particularly food exporters experience the market. Over the past decade, we've seen a steady rise in state measures that make it harder for goods, services, and foreign firms to compete across borders. This includes things like export restrictions, subsidies, and taken together, these now represent around 70% of interventions globally, known as discriminatory measures, which you can see on the chart. But it's important to be nuanced here, I think. It isn't a universal shift so much. Many countries are still working to open markets. The overall rise in protectionism is still driven mainly by a few large economies whose policies carry a very outsized weight. And this links directly to the rise in policy uncertainty as well, we are seeing globally. When major economies keep changing the rules, it creates a level of unpredictability that spreads through the global supply chain. Even economies that stay open tend to feel the effects because their exporters must navigate markets where the rules are constantly shifting. So for smaller businesses, this environment of uncertainty is a challenge. Larger companies can usually absorb the cost of this, but smaller firms usually struggle to keep up. When the real rules keep changing on them, they cannot adopt, and many either reduce or stop trading altogether. For ASEAN, this matters a lot, especially with our food and beverage sector, because our food and beverage value chain is deeply intertwined within the markets. So moving from the global picture to our own region, the numbers show that ASEAN's food trade has grown steadily, which is the good news. But with the trade within the region itself does remain quite limited. Even though total food exports have grown about 30% in recent years, the share of intra-ASEAN trade or inter-regional trade has barely changed. We can see about 18% over 2 decades ago in 2003, and only around 23% today in 2024. In other words, most of ASEAN's growth in food exports are still directed outside of the region. Some of this may reflect structural features of the sector, in addition to regulatory and connectivity issues that we will talk about later. For instance, a few countries, Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, and Vietnam, account for almost 80% of ASEAN's food exports. And they tend to produce similar products like palm oil, seafood, rice-based products. That sort of leads to overlaps in production and fewer opportunities for supply chain complementarity across borders. Yep. So building on that structural picture we just saw, one major factor that continues to limit, I would say, trade integration is regulatory divergence, which is mainly the focus of the research, particularly around food standards and also labeling requirements. Here we looked at how far different ASEAN member states have aligned in international food standards, known as Codex, and what that means for businesses on the ground. What we see is quite a mixed picture, as you can see as well. Countries like Malaysia, Singapore, and Vietnam show relatively strong alignment. Others, including Indonesia and Thailand, have partial and sort of moderate alignment, for example, covering only certain products or certain categories. And in several CLM economies, implementation is still limited, particularly for hygiene standards and also for lab testing protocols. So these differences translate directly into higher costs and also longer timelines for firms, especially for MSMEs. So in our interviews, businesses mentioned several reoccurring challenges. There are sometimes implementation issues as well. For example, front of pack labeling that's mandatory in one country but voluntary in another, it creates inconsistency in health messaging and also in terms of the business that they do. Origin and importer details that vary between markets, causing a lot of custom delays and reapprovals, and also very minor issues like date marking differences, best before in one place versus expiry date in some places, that has led to shipment rejections and also relabeling costs. So these may seem like relatively small regulatory details, but they do add up, particularly for smaller exporters that do not have the capacity to customize packaging, also to navigate multiple approval systems. Building on the earlier example of fragmented regulation, I think one of the most practical ways to reduce regulatory friction is through digital certification and the interoperability of systems. So this slide sort of gives a simplified picture of that. And supporting this are digital enablers such as the risk management systems, cold chain monitoring, and also traceability tools like blockchain, which strengthens data integrity and helps build trust across borders. But for all of this to work, we need an underlying foundation of interoperability between digital government systems in the ASEAN member states, whether it's customs, health, education, or agriculture or trade, along with clear legal frameworks and data sharing rules. So interoperability remains a challenge within ASEAN in a few ways. It's not just about cross-border connectivity. And the problems also exist within the countries itself. Many systems used by customs, agriculture, and health authorities still operate on separate digital platforms, which don't automatically exchange data. As a result, domestic coordination gaps often become a bottleneck before the data even reaches regional level. So to bring this, the progress in ASEAN has been a bit uneven. Some promising initiatives are underway. For example, there is the ASEAN e-Phyto pilot supported by ASCAP, which sort of aims to enable electronic exchange of phytosanitary certifications among member states. But participation is still limited. Only a few ASEAN member states are currently piloting data exchange programs, while others continue to operate on standalone national e-Phyto systems. So to bring this a bit closer to the ground, we looked at a few real cases when we did our research. To show how digital traceability and cold chain systems could make a difference in practice. So earlier this year, I think China rejected over about 64,000 kilograms of Thai durian after detecting banned dyes, which was a major loss for exporters. If a digital traceability or cold chain system had been in place, authorities could have identified and sort of isolated this issue earlier on. So it's a clear example of how better traceability can protect not just safety, but also market reputation as well. And also another one of recurring issues that was highlighted by MSMEs when he interviewed them were logistics issues. If you look at an overview of ASEAN's logistic performance over time, this is the Logistic Performance Index by the World Bank. Broadly, the picture on logistics is one of partial progress for ASEAN. Some countries like Singapore, Malaysia, and Vietnam have seen clear gains, but for others, the progress has been quite uneven and non-linear. You can see periods where performance plateau and even dips, especially around 2016 to 2018. So while ASEAN's logistics system itself has been improving overall, the pace and consistency differs sharply between the countries. And when we look at the six components, of the Logistics Performance Index, we can see that improvements are not uniform across dimensions. Areas like customs efficiency and timelines have improved gradually, but it reflects the impact of trade facilitation reforms. But infrastructure and tracking systems have seen much slower progress, particularly among lower income ASEAN members. So to sort of unpack the logistics dimensions a bit further, there are some practical bottlenecks that we've observed both from data and also from interviews. First, the border unpredictability still remains a key challenge, especially for MSMEs. Clearance times can vary widely from as fast as 6 hours in Singapore to as long as 3 days in certain countries. Secondly, there's still cold chain capacity gaps. Only about 30 to 40% of ASEAN's perishable exports move under temperature control conditions, which affects food safety, shelf life, especially for smaller producers, and these are very important in the food and beverage sector. Thirdly, it's a diminished threshold, the minimum shipment value that's allowed for duties. This also varies greatly across ASEAN, from 40 USD in Vietnam to 300 USD in Brunei. This penalizes small e-commerce food shipments as well. And container requirements often compel smaller firms to fill full container loads before shipments, and which can be quite unfeasible for MSMEs trading in small volumes, pushing some of them into informal channels to move goods more flexibly. So to wrap up, I just want to highlight a few practical steps that can be made for ASEAN's food trade, so that ASEAN's food trade can be more predictable, more efficient, and also more inclusive. Firstly, I think we need stronger alignment on food labeling. I would want to caveat this as well, because there has been a lot of guidelines, a lot of progress made in terms of harmonization for ASEAN. They recently endorsed the nutrition labeling standard as well in, I believe, August 2025. So there are measures in place, but it's not mandatory, and countries are still continuing to design their own food systems. Moving towards a more streamlined, for example, front pack labeling would reduce conflicting rules and also reduce production costs. And to make this more workable, we need more structured consultations, I believe, with businesses, especially MSMEs, and also with women entrepreneurs. So these rules match their capacity and also their compliance. And secondly, also ASEAN should also advance digital labeling in terms of QR codes. This will provide multilingual, up-to-date information without constant reprinting. And thirdly, we need to also have a more connected digital phytosanitary certification throughout ASEAN. In terms of the ASEAN single window, streamlining procedures, I think that would really help as well. And some countries still use separate systems, and it's not connected to global partners. So this creates a lot of unnecessary costs and also unnecessary complexity. And logistics also needs targeted support. Regional guidance on halal logistics especially, better financing options, and also container sharing schemes would help small exporters to access regional markets more easily. So finally, ASEAN also needs to invest in cold chain and also next generation regulatory technology. IoT sensors can monitor temperature and also reduce spoilage, which is very important for the food and beverage sector. And MSMEs also need financing and training to use these tools. Any public-private partnership can also help build share cold chain facilities as well. And looking ahead, I think ASEAN should also start setting regional guidelines for AI-assisted labeling, for example, and also risk-based inspection. I think paired with strong MSME support, so no one is left behind on food regulation when it becomes digital. So these were sort of the findings that we had for our research, and we will also continue to have our discussion during the panel discussion as well. So thank you.
Testing. Thank you, Sharmila, for the excellent presentation. Please remain on stage and take your seat to moderate the panel discussion. To start the discussion, let's invite to the stage all the esteemed panelists, Prof. Evelyn Devadasan, Dr. Tina Marie Rodwong, and Mr. S. Jai Shankar. Sharmila, over to you.
Okay, hi again. I apologize in advance. You'll be seeing a lot of me today. But hopefully I'll keep the talking to minimum and the panelists will be able to talk a lot more. But thanks again for staying on for the panel on a Friday. I know it's a bit of a end of the week, but thanks a lot for staying on. Maybe I'll start by introducing our panelists. We have here Mr. S.J. Shankar, who's also a Senior Director at the Malaysian International Trade Development Corporation, MATRADE, who has been overseeing 49 international offices and has long experience in policy making. We also have Dr. Tina, who is the Head of Business Management Program at Sri Patum University in Bangkok. And we also have Prof. Evelyn, who is the Professor of Faculty of Business and Economics at University Malaya. I'll be asking them a few opening questions, but I'll also come to the audience in a bit because we also like the audience to ask questions as well and also shape the conversation that we're having today. So please do ask your questions, keep them to in the middle of the discussion. We will open it up to the audience as well. I know a lot of context has already been set today, I think with the presentation and also with Tan Sri's speech as well. But maybe I'll just reiterate some of the points before we start our focus questions for the first opening question. So over the past decade, I think we've seen that tariffs have sort of broadly fallen across markets as markets liberalized tariffs, notwithstanding the recent geopolitical tensions, of course, with the new tariff actions by some major economies that have sort of introduced uncertainty into the global trade system. And across ASEAN, I think obviously MSMEs form the backbone of our economies, particularly in the food and beverage sector. Yet they seem to always face the same trade and regulatory requirements as larger firms as well, with fewer resources to navigate them, as I've mentioned earlier. At the same time, more new and complex forms of borders are emerging, not in the form of higher tariffs, but through increasingly intricate requirements on food standards, labeling, digital traceability, and also logistics systems. So I guess my opening question for all the speakers is, in this context, what do you see is the most important factor to ensure ASEAN's FMB trade remains inclusive for MSMEs? Even as global standards, technologies, and border requirements continue to evolve. Maybe you want to start with Mr. J first?
Okay, very good morning, Sharmila. Thank you very much. Tan Sri, of course, Mr. Ong Kia Meng, distinguished guests, friends from the industry, government sector, and so on. Thank you very much for the opportunity to give Malaysia, MATRADE this opportunity to have a say. So basically, to just recap, I suppose the question is, with the challenges faced by MSMEs, what can they do? Is that what you're saying, Shamila? Okay, all right. Okay, so I think as all of us know, MSMEs are, basically in terms of demographic profile, they constitute the largest segment of businesses across the countries across ASEAN, including the most sophisticated ones such as Singapore and Malaysia. So in the case of Malaysia, it has been our focus, the government's focus, to try to see whether the MSMEs, which probably constitute about 95% of all businesses today in Malaysia, have a greater say in terms of export contribution to begin with. Yeah, I think at last count, the export contribution from MSMEs is something like 14.2, 14.3% of the overall export, and the target is to reach 25% in about 2030. Now, the challenges are obviously there, but what we are trying to navigate through is to provide them a level of comfort, saying that while it appears to be difficult, there are opportunities out there. Now, if you take a historical step back at how Malaysian exporters have done in terms of their export destinations in the past, typically they would have gone and they've looked at US and the Europe market. That was many years back when we still had sort of a developing status to leverage upon. And then subsequently, over the years, the export destination started getting a bit more varied. Then we started looking at East Asia, China principally. We started looking at Middle East. And slowly, gradually over the years, our exports to ASEAN has also started growing. In comparison with all the export destinations, if you look in that perspective, the complications or perceived complications in regards to exporting within the region as opposed to markets such as EU and US, where we have reasonably prospered, is a lot better and a lot easier. Yeah. So from the MSME bit, the one potentially would struggle is the more micro companies. For that, the two-pronged strategies that, in the case of Matrade, for example, that we've looked at, one is to start looking at possibility of them, taking a more gingerly step into the export journey by looking at things like e-commerce. Right? The second bit is basically to literally get them to participate in more trade promotion events. Right? This is being done through support such as grants available under the market development grant and so on. The third bit I think is also very critical is to address the concerns that is being hyped up in the media. For example, a lot of conversation takes place in regards to ESG concerns, for example. Yeah. So the emphasis here for us is to provide them the comfort of saying that you are not starting from zero, which is actually entirely the truth. There is a lot of misperception among a lot of companies, thinking that the journey in ESG is going to be a complicated one. Not quite realizing that in actual fact, if they go through a basic checklist of what they're doing in terms of the E and the S and the G, there's a good chance they've already conformed to some parts of the E and some parts of the S and some part of the G. The E bit, for example, many of us are already into, let's say, ISO 1400s, for example. Yeah? So there is already some conformity. The S, you could already, maybe hiring an OKU or a single mother or your practices in terms of getting foreign labor and all that is still up to par. G, you might have a code of conduct already instituted, right? So we want to give them the comfort saying that, look, it thinks it's not as complicated as it's perceived to be. But at the same time, there has to be a reality check as well. So from a reality check point of view is that there's a lot of advocacy and a lot of awareness processes that takes place for these MSMEs to make sure that they get upgraded and be ready of being part of the global supply chain. And oftentimes, I think in the Malaysian case especially, even with the larger companies, there is not enough appreciation in terms of differentiating between the concept of being global and world-class. A lot of our companies are potentially global, but not necessarily world-class. Yeah. So in the case of the MSMEs, especially if you're the new exporters, we are, basically encouraging them to immediately start thinking on a more world-class approach. World-class in the context of go for the best practices. Yeah, do not get dictated. You only get stressed out and get demotivated and all that if you feel that you're trying to reach out to the sky by force. Right? Somebody's trying to force you to do so and so on. But if we are proactive and the thought process is such that you are you already have that approach of saying, I need to be world class to be part of the global supply chain. From day one, you're already putting up the processes and governance framework as well and the right best practices to be able to do so. So that sort of advocacy is also taking place.
Thank you. I think what you're saying, mainly the main factor would be in terms of awareness and also in terms of, I guess, building their entrepreneurial skill. I think that would be summarizing what you said. Maybe we move to Dr. Tina now. Yeah.
Hi. Okay. Yes, for me, simplify answer is communities, and from my research and talking to all the farmers on the ground and different layers of the supply chain, what they need is friends doing the same thing. Basically, they want to learn and do it together with their friends. So what my research is about digital traceability systems, and we want, farmers who have like less than an acre to join some kind of system where they can export. And they said, well, they don't have a problem learning new system and adopting and applying it. What they want to be able to do is access markets, right? So if we have multiple communities where, MSMEs are connected to each other, then they have access to each other in different communities, and this allows them to, trade amongst each other, and this kind of same as like Lazada, Shopee, and other platform where commerce happens, it can happen in the food supply chain as well. So this is like the idea that they were looking for mostly. And the second one, go back to the motivation. In these communities, motivation is their community, like their friends, their relationship. Hey, you're doing that, let me try that too, right? And it works out for you, or it failed for you. We can learn from each other. So I think it's about bringing back this like kind of cooperative community where maybe even during COVID, during some kind of transformation of different governments in every region, even through switching of leadership that happens in communities, cooperatives tend to die very quickly if there's no continuous support system. So we bring back cooperatives and we bring back the community where we help each other, and that will get them to be competitive and trade amongst each other. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we looked at our research also last year, I think, was that on MSMEs, one of the most important part is also network. I think that's what you're also referring to. I think in terms of internationalization, network connectivity is very important, and sort of building, I guess, the community that you mentioned about. Yeah, that was an interesting point I also found last year as well. Maybe, Prof, do you want to continue?
Yeah, firstly, I'd like to thank Ideas for the opportunity to share my thoughts here. Coming back to the question on how do we get SMEs to go regional or go even global, my opinion is that we have had a lot of high-level policies, and we talk a lot about inclusive trade, but these high-level policies are not sufficient to bring in MSMEs on board. Yeah? And why do I say that? I think the focus has been a lot on market access. Rightfully, yes, market access is a problem for MSMEs because they have to face high business compliance costs. For the food and beverage sector within ASEAN, you have different conformity assessment procedures, different SPS measures, and so on. And the issue is not about the number of non-tariff measures or the number or the incidence of these measures, but it's rather the divergent regulations that are causing a problem. Now, if you focus on market access, it is not going to target MSMEs, in my opinion. I think what you should target is capability access. MSMEs are actually struggling with capacity. Capability access would be a prerequisite to market access. So before we talk about MSMEs going global, I think a key point is to actually help them upgrade. And what do I mean by capability access? It would be, let's take, for example, I think Shamila, in your report, you mentioned about digital traceability. Everyone says that MSMEs can use e-commerce and therefore that's a platform for them to go regional or even global. But let's talk about traceability in that sense. Firstly, in terms of technology, most of them are just using having a web page to increase visibility. They haven't gone beyond that. So let me take an example, a broad example within the F&B sector. Let's take, I think your report focused on prepackaged food. Let's look at the fishing sector. Yeah? And you did mention that cold chain logistics is a big problem. A lot of fish, they get spoiled before they even reach the consumer. Yeah, so spoilages are very common. Now, what kind of technology would you need? That you will need digital traceability. RFID tagging in supply chain for fish is very, very important. That comes at a cost. So this is where you need to help SMEs to implement RFID tagging in supply chains. And this is where the government probably can provide specific financing support. When you talk about the F&B sector, it's actually very heterogeneous. It is very differentiated. So targeting, it has to be direct, to be specific to certain subsectors, and it has to be based on the evidence, right? So here we have evidence of poor digital traceability. So how do we help them? So the issue is not market access yet. That is the end of it. The issue is capability access, and how do we drive capability to market access? Because once they have got that kind of digital upskilling, there's sufficient tech diffusion, they are supported with financing that is very specific, only then they can actually think of market access. To give you an example also, the F&B sector, even within pre-packaged, you would have heard about Julie's. How did Julie's go regional and global? It was by innovating. If you look at Julie's biscuits, how they've innovated. Can all SMEs come on board and do that? Julie was considered, I don't know now it's considered, it was that time considered a medium-sized company, right? So the sector itself is highly differentiated. Even when preparing for this event, I was just doing some simple reading and quick reading, and I was shocked to see beverage companies are already experimenting with AI-generated drink flavors. So can you imagine the kind of speed of technology and innovation that's happening in this highly differentiated sector? So I think, coming back to your question, what is the most important factor? I think you cannot miss the target. The target is not market access. You need to get back to the fundamentals and think about capability access, because once they actually upgrade their production processes, technology diffusion is quite holistic within their company. It is not just point solutions like having a web page. Only then will these SMEs be able to plug into certain supply chains and go global or regional.
Yeah, thank you. That was a very interesting distinction, I think, between capabilities and also market access. I think it was an important distinction to make. We will come back later to Dr. Tina, I think, talk about the digital side of things, since it's your expertise as well. But maybe, Prof, I know you just spoke, but maybe I can ask you a question. Maybe I'll go back to Prof first. I think you take it a bit globally as well. I'm sure everyone in the room knows about the global changes that's been happening in trade. I know you mentioned about how the rising non-tariff measures itself isn't really about the numbers, but it is about the heterogeneity in that. But in terms of all the renewed geopolitical uncertainties that are happening, how do you see these dynamics shaping the ASEAN F&B trade, particularly for MSMEs? And where can sort of deeper, because we were talking about regional integration a lot, but where can deeper regional integration make a difference, I think, in keeping trade both open and inclusive?
Let me answer the first part of the question, which is how the current changes in trade. I mean, we are moving from a traditional mode to digital trade, yeah? And that's in a way beneficial, and that allows for a certain amount of inclusive trade. But before we get into that, I think, Shamila, you spoke about regulatory misalignment from a physical goods kind of trade. But let's look at digital data governance. Yeah, I mean, of course, we have the Digital Economy Framework Agreement at the regional level, but before we think at a very high level policy, I was just looking at some statistics. If I could share, this is very recent. When they looked at the Digital Trade Regulatory Similarity Index, yeah, ASEAN scores, or rather Asia Pacific broadly scores 0.37. The closer it is to zero shows that the more divergent we are. And this is even higher than other regions such as Africa and Latin America. So this is quite telling that even when you talk about e-commerce and getting on digital platforms, these companies are going to struggle with divergent regulations in terms of data, security or data privacy, consumer protection, and so on, yeah? Whatever that governs e-commerce. So I see this as a problem that needs to be also addressed, the complexity of the digital trade regulatory landscape within ASEAN. In terms of uncertainty, of course, uncertainty affects all firms across board. For SMEs, it may be more serious because their networks may be more confined. They don't have broad networks. They are less diversified than larger firms. So these two issues, besides the regulatory misalignment for physical goods in terms of SPS and all these factors are actually not mutually exclusive. There's an interplay of these factors that are affecting SMEs. In terms of regional cooperation, of course, globally, even when it's not MSME specific or FNB specific, everybody says that with growing uncertainty, we should all go regional. Now, is it practical? And your report points out also that there are less complementarities in terms of the food F&B sector. But let's keep that complementarity issue aside. Let's look at vertical integration in supply chains. SMEs are not vertically integrated. And if I can draw on one example in Indonesia that was looking, how vertical integration through supply chains is done at the domestic level, not even cross-border yet. So let's look at the F&B sector broadly in terms of primary commodities, such as seafood and pre-packaged. If you look at Indofood in Indonesia partners with smallholders. So you've got that upstream connection and with the food packaging MSMEs, and it also is complemented by Tani Hub, which is a digital integration platform. So you can see some kind of cohesive cluster-based production kind of structure evolving in Indonesia. We don't see much of that in other countries. So I think one way of getting SMEs into supply chains is by having this kind of like contract farming, cluster-based, where upstream and downstream can connect. And that connection may not be only domestic, that connection can be cross-border. So I think one way to get SMEs is to get them plugged into some supply chain. Once you're plugged into that supply chain, it helps you to increase your capability. So this is where capability expansion comes in, right? They have the networks, because very often SMEs don't have that distribution networks and so on. And then tech capabilities would also come in. So I see vertical integration through supply chains as something that is quite important, be it if it's done domestically or across board.
Yeah, I think you touched a lot on digital as well. So maybe I'll come back to Dr. Tina. There are a lot of emerging technologies, I think, in terms of AI, blockchain, and IoT. How can this be made more accessible to smaller enterprises so that they can, increase their inclusion rather than widen the gap between large and small exporters? Because I think Prof also spoke about how there should be capability upgrading. But in what ways for technology do you think that it will be important?
Training is the most way to get you there, and we do it in two steps. Let's say, like, training is not just like, I have this technology, let me train you on this technology. That's not going to work, right? So we need to look at each of the different sectors. Like in food, they're all different. Nobody has any similarities. Even like the similar kind of fruit, they behave differently, right? Like durian and mangosteen. They grow in the same place, but you can't collect them the same way. You can't manage them the same way. So we need to look at how the behavior of the practice first, and then assess from their behavior and their access, like internet, electricity, cell phones, computers, laptops, like what access do they have, power that they have, these kind of things, and choose the technology that fits for each of these industry. But that's where the more important thing is policy, where there is a protocol that makes sure that the technology chosen anyway can use the same API to connect the systems together. For example, in Thailand, we don't use WhatsApp, right? So everyone use Line, like for everything, right? And when we get to farmers, they just want to say like, why can't we just use Line? So then the solution ends up being, okay, if we want to have any kind of system, the information needs to be coming in the application that everyone is already using, which cannot be applied to every country, right? So then we would then develop a particular protocol, an API protocol, that can link this information input from this one system, but can be read in another centralized system where the data can share. So it's like steps like this that is a bit tedious in the end, but for it to work, it needs to be this way, right? Because it's like shrimp farms, right? They have access, they have to have temperature control and things like this. So then this needs to link to temperature control IoT device and maybe link to GPS to make sure that this is the actual farm it comes from, right? So depending on how serious or the steps to trace back that we want, right? So then we would design maybe groups of potential system and how it can work. So this would be the steps, and then we would need to train how to use and understand the user's behavior, right? So when we did another research on, this is not food, but timber, right? So we were looking at women access to technology so they are able to input information on timber export, right? It turns out actually in the countryside, women have cell phones, but they don't actually have internet in their cell phone, right? So then this is also important then, that input of data should be able to happen anytime, but once internet access is available, it's able to send the data. So it should be able to like backlog. So this is like some examples that needs to happen in progressing technology adoption through the whole vertical supply chain and building the skills that individual sectors need. Yeah.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about also is in terms of interoperability, I think, across the region. That's also something that we touched on in the report as well, because I think different systems function differently and the interoperability within those systems are important as well.
Yeah, and it's not just this industry, because in finance, it's the same problem, right? Every industry has this problem when there is no clear policy guideline that is shared amongst traders, yeah.
Okay, maybe I'll come to Mr. J now. So we've been speaking a lot about digital, we're speaking a lot about facilitation in that sense as well, but ASEAN has made a lot of progress in terms of trade facilitation and digital trade initiatives, but somehow the implementation does still remain quite uneven across the member states. Maybe if you want to speak about it from your perspective, what are some of the more promising efforts that are underway in Malaysia or even in ASEAN, if you're aware of, that can sort of close these gaps, you believe?
You're absolutely right. And the policies are there. I think Tan Sri was also mentioning about it. It's always an implementation. And that's never easy. I remember when I was based in Bangkok, I used to get, there'll be goods stuck at the border, Malaysia, Thailand, and somebody will call me, and then I will rush to the local custom office in Bangkok, and then he will make that call, and then that cargo will be let go. And then it will happen again in the following week, and so on. So I think at a very high level, clearly everybody shares the similar aspiration in order to integrate trade and get that going. But on an implementation level, especially in sometimes agencies such as customs and immigration and so on, you do face roadblocks. So perhaps while retaining the more high level aspirations and big picture. Easy win approach would probably be an option that we can pursue. For example, in the case of Matre, Matre is a trade promotion organization. One thing can be done, and that taking the cue from Prof's capability bit as well, is perhaps one way to, because all of us are built, TPOs are built to promote exports. It's a one-way traffic, but trade is never a one-way traffic. It needs to be two ways, right? So perhaps if we take it from an ASEAN perspective, what we can do potentially is build a database of companies with capabilities that we can share with one another, right? Because, if you are just hoping that this will happen on an organic basis, it could be tricky. So you have policies to facilitate that thought process, but the actual implementation will be a bit more slower, largely because it has been left for an organic process to take place, right? So, but if it is as an active intervention by the respective TPOs, and most ASEAN countries have established TPOs under usually the Ministry of Commerce or Trade, then you can start building up a very concerted, a very structured database of MSMEs who can provide what, right? And the context is that I know today's discussion is a lot about intra-ASEAN trade, which is good. But your report also, clearly points out, rightfully, is that a lot of trade now happens globally, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. So the way to look at this database, if it's built, is to, do intra-trade, yes, but also be a function to the export agendas of the respective countries, right? Because everybody is trying to promote. But what we don't have, most times, in Malaysia included, is that we are unable to sort of complete the value chain in terms of the export matrix, right? So oftentimes what happens, we can only provide one part of it. You might have a buyer, but you can only provide one part of the equation, right? But if there is an active collaboration among ASEAN countries and you do have that particular database to sort of fall back on, you can then, for example, let's say, you have maybe it's an intermediate product and you can then source from somebody else and then you sort of push it out, right? So rather than doing a sourcing from another country altogether out of ASEAN, you can now actively start sourcing within ASEAN and so on. That's one part. The other part, I think, from a policy point of view, perhaps greater thought can be given in order to further enhance and strengthen intra-ASEAN trade, is to look at the respective countries' government procurement. If some level of support can be given for an ASEAN, you have local content, right? A lot of times you got a local content play in most countries, right? But if the local content play, somehow we can sort of expand that to an ASEAN content play, that would also quickly facilitate, because the worst thing that can happen going to a private sector is with one, very complicated, fangled policy that does not have, at the end of the rainbow, doesn't have money, right? So, and I think that's where ultimately a lot of policies tend to fail, because you don't sort of provide them with the commercial imperative required for that particular motivation to take place, right? So if you go to the companies and say, guys, now get into this particular database, because at the end of it, actively the respective TPOs are going to start pushing and sort of getting that collaboration actively to put in place. Above and beyond that, potentially there could be some areas of government procurement across ASEAN where some level of support can be given for fellow ASEAN suppliers, right? So, and the bottom line is, basically we have to structure not only the broad policies, but the interventionist activities has to be something that can be executed practically, quickly, and with financial impact to the MSMEs as soon as possible. Thank you.
I think what you're saying also, I think similar to what Prof was saying earlier about vertical integration in terms of value chain. So it's a direct example of an intervention that you're talking about. So that's an interesting point. I think I'll open it up for the audience Q&A. Maybe we'll take a few questions first so that we have a bit more of an engaging conversation with the audience as well. If you would like to participate in the conversation. If there are any questions, yes, please, Dr. Ong.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the very interesting report coming from the F&B MSME point of view, and also for the the views of the panelists. My question is more on the policy side of things from a lobbying perspective, Jaishankar, you would have seen things from the Matrade standpoint and maybe the MITI standpoint. Usually for things like DIFA and other ASEAN-related upgrade, including the upcoming Artiga upgrade discussions, my sense is that a lot of the big companies would be represented at these discussions. You talk about DIFA, definitely the multinationals in the e-commerce sector and all that will be there. But when you're talking about MSMEs, including the farmers and whatnot, what would be a more effective way for them to lobby the policy makers so that their problem statements can be taken more seriously by them, and also to be able to let the policy makers know that a lot of the technical barriers to trade may not necessarily be useful to protect the SMEs in this particular sector, and may even prevent them from exporting to other markets. So, Prof. Evelyn, what you said about Indonesia is interesting, in terms of the integration of that aspect of the Indomie ecosystem. But as you know, Indonesia also has one of the highest TBTs in ASEAN, a lot of quotas for importing any item. So any thoughts on how this can be overcome for the benefit of the SMEs in the F&B sector?
Thank you, Dr. Ong. Maybe we'll get another question if anyone has any questions. Anyone else has any questions? Yes, please.
Obviously, there's the, talking about local content quotas. Thanks. Hopefully my voice isn't too loud now. But do you guys think that there is a genuine political will, both at the grassroots and amongst leadership, as the ASEAN leadership rotates, do you think there's actually genuine political will for deeper economic integration? Because, we can talk about quotas, talking about local content quotas and things like that. These are quite sensitive issues politically. And I guess one thing that concerns me is there deeper political will to really seriously pursue serious integration? Because, we're talking about Matrade, we're talking about promotion, but there's also the flip side of industrial policy, local content quotas. And yeah, I'm curious to see whether what you see as the sort of long-term appetite for integration. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Oliver. Are there maybe one more question if anyone else has? Yeah.
Hello, Tess. Hi. I'm just curious, from the report, is there a rough calculation of how much the figure, how much ASEAN, the regional partners are living, are living on the table from not trading more with each other? For instance, because if you look at the other way around, for example, a big Korean conglomerate, Shinsegae, they partnered with Mami to OEM their foodstuff so that, they can also unlock the whole regional market, leveraging on Mami's know-how, and also Mixu as well. They actually they tried to enter the Indonesian halal market, and once there, and it also unlocks the whole ASEAN regional market for them as well. So because if this is happening, I can imagine for our MSMEs, food, F&B sector also will be losing out. So I'm just curious, because at least the policymakers can also be aware in terms of how much, the figure that from F&B trade we are losing are losing out, and perhaps any measures to mitigate all these issues. Thanks.
Thanks, Pekwa. Maybe we'll start with Dr. Ong's question first. I think it was mostly directed to Mr. J. In terms of the policy side and the lobbying perspective, I think what amount of inclusion I think is for MSMEs? Is it mostly larger firms that are able to contribute to these discussions? And also, what is the more effective way for them to engage with policymakers?
The ex-boss of okay, this is how I think I see it from two perspectives. One is the MSMEs probably need to be better structured. They are not structured. In some countries, for example, Germany, the moment you are registered, you become part of an association, and there's a very structured way. Today, because the way, in the case of Malaysia, at least, we're very decentralized in terms of formation of associations and so on. So there is no one specific polity that can sort of embrace and represent the whole business sector. And by virtue of that, clearly many of the MSMEs perhaps voice is not heard during policy deliberations and so on, perhaps, and I put that in marks. But then that leads to the second, I think, thought process, which is, I think a lot of times, at least in the case of MSMEs, the onus then is on the policymakers to be able to engage them constructively and make sure that their interests are duly protected. MITI has always been engaged stakeholders as well as it can, but as with in any such processes, there would be pockets of spots where maybe we did not address adequately. So I think the policy measure has to be two. One is we have to find a way to get them, a bit more structured so that their voice is heard. Two, put additional support in terms of reaching out to them. For example, if their voice is not heard at a particular policy deliberation, then we basically have to zero in and say, look, MSME was not represented in that particular process, and we basically have to go out there and engage them and so on, right? So I think that would be the case. Maybe since I have the phone, since I have the mic, I'll just jump into the populism bit as well. This is not a Marxist official stand of sort, but I think it's important for us to sort of realize that ASEAN was never meant to be an economic grouping per se, right? So it is not akin to EU or anything of that sort. But what is happening potentially is that because it's largely we're all mostly based on very pro-business policies, we're very export-oriented. By virtue of that, we have been party to a lot of bilateral and multilateral agreements. And by virtue of that, there's a lot of loosening of regulatory aspects, and all that has already happened. So there's one part that's already facilitated very organically all that, basic problems that usually happens when countries are trying to work together. That's one. Two, by the fact that ASEAN at this point of time is one of the highest growth model. If you look at anywhere in the world, if you ask one particular exporter anywhere in the world, where do you want to export to? It's most likely Southeast Asia, right? And we are neighbors, so it just makes logical sense for us to start reaching out to each other and so on. So I think ultimately to answer the question, is there a political will? There is clearly a political will driven by commercial interests. But there are, of course, constraints because ASEAN, it's a very diverse polity. You have a Catholic state, you have a Muslim state, you have a socialist state, you have a state run by junta, and a whole bunch of things, right? So you do have that differences, but it is always, ASEAN usually is run on a economic model. So from that optics, that push, it's genuine. It's absolutely genuine. To what end? That is something that organically will happen over the years.
Maybe if I can just probe a bit further about Dr. Ong's question. Currently, maybe in the recent any negotiations that have been happening, has there been any inclusion of MSMEs, and also to what extent? I think if I can ask, if you could share. No, I mean, in terms of negotiations or discussions, how much of MSMEs have actually been included in the discussion?
Okay, look, we do engage them. For example, on a minimum, usually in any sort of such deliberations, you would have SME association in there, you would have Samantha in there, and collectively these 2 or 3 associations do represent a fair bit of businesses. This is on top of the big boys, but the big boys also have a lot of small boys in them. The Malay chamber, the Indian chamber, the Chinese chamber, they are all usually a mainstay in such deliberations. So I think where is coming from is even beyond that, right? Truly smaller, the agriculture guys and all that. Perhaps we might have missed out that bit because MITI by nature is it looks into manufacturing companies and so on.
Okay, thank you. Prof, did you have anything else to add as well?
Probably I answer the first and second question. The one by Dr. Ong, whether they are well represented, probably at the regional level. So we have the ASEAN caucus, which has been recently launched, and that allows for some dialogue, but we don't know to what extent. It's quite recent. We have the ASEAN Access for Training. Also, I'm not sure what's the update, but generally at the regional level, I feel MSMEs may not be well represented because we did a study with the ASEAN Food and Beverage Alliance some time back, which is also on food and beverages. We wanted to streamline regulations in terms of nutrition labeling. After that, the guidelines have come out. It was represented, of course, we worked with the bigger players within ASEAN. But in terms of, I always think what happens at the regional level, because it's more of streamlining non-tariff measures. So it doesn't really matter because these measures are applied across board to SMEs and big firms. So if the streamlining takes place, everyone benefits from it. But the thing is, for SMEs, this is secondary to their capability issues. So if it happens, it works well for the SMEs, but before that, they have to go regional. So streamlining always happens at the regional level, and those measures are non-discriminatory. They apply to all firm sizes. So if that happens, it's good for everyone on board. The second question on, I think you were in our FGD too. The second question on, which is on the political will. I think it's really difficult to streamline. That's why everyone stopped talking about harmonizing regulations, which is a bit more loaded. So people talked about streamlining, and that's where your mutual recognition agreements come in to accept testing and certification, to avoid duplication and so on. But how much of these MRAs are utilized? That's a question. And let's take F&B. F&B, I think a key issue is labeling for SPS reasons, yeah. Also product standards, contaminants and products and so on. It's quite hard if we look at ASEAN level, how many products could they actually streamline? We discussed this even in the FGD. It takes time because different countries don't want to give in. Even the nutrition labeling, I had a chance to get into the Langkawi dialogue and only 5 minutes to pitch for nutrition labeling to be standardized, at least the core elements. You could see immediately Thailand and Philippines getting really upset about it because they have more, some make it mandatory, some make it voluntary, and then some have 4 elements that are mandatory within nutrition labeling, some 7 elements. So I think it's always a very, very difficult task to streamline. That will is there. Everybody talks about, uncertainty, let's go regional. But the actual fact is it's more difficult to trade regionally than outside the region, yeah? And sometimes the markets are also outside the region. If you talk about food products, everybody wants to engage with China. The market is there, the home market base is there. So how much can we trade regionally? I mean, it may be limited to specific products, and only those who can comply with these varying procedures will be able to penetrate those markets. We talked a lot about even language on the labeling. Yeah. So how do we actually streamline that? Every country will pull to have their own language on that label, no matter how small that label is. So I think yeah, probably true, where that's what they were saying, that you have the QR code and then it links to the web and you can access all the information and read, but are we really there? And that's also a cost issue for MSMEs, which we discussed in the EU during the EU discussion. So I would think to close that, I would think the will is there, people have said it, but in terms of reality, it's quite a difficult issue to streamline regulations at the regional level and to see really tangible outcomes. But having said that, if I could share, we did the study on trade facilitation. At that point in time, they were talking about the ASEAN customs transit system. And yesterday, they released this data in April 2025, especially for F&B products that cross border between Malaysia, Thailand. They said that it removed some paperwork and it also reduced border times for perishable cargo, especially fruits and vegetables. So Thailand's pilot with Malaysia and Singapore, which has taken off, the release times have fallen below 30 minutes at each key checkpoint. Now, whether this is really true, you will be able to confirm it, but these are the statistics that have been released. So 30 minutes is helpful, and for the trucks that cross those border, and because the goods are highly perishable, especially within F&B. So there may be some specks of tangible outcomes that we see, but generally when you talk about streamlining, I think it's really a difficult issue. Yeah.
Dr. Tina, did you also have something to add? Okay. I think the third question from Pekwa, I think, was directed to me. In terms of calculations, I think the International Trade Center has a database on export potential, and through that they have a disaggregation based on HS code for each sector, and that data actually shows you how much of the export potential is unrealized. So in that sense, you can see which sectors have higher or lower export potential that has not been realized. But I think you're also talking about in terms of how that can help to fill in the gaps in the sector itself. I'm not sure if Madrid has any initiatives in that sense, but in terms of higher level data, yes, there is. But in terms of local issues, I'm not exactly sure if there is. But data-wise, there is in the International Trade Center, ITC. Yeah. Are there any other questions? Maybe we can take more questions here. The gentleman in front first, yeah.
Yes, it seems to be working. Okay. Just a couple of questions. Is there a much tariff between ASEAN nations? What about tariffs? Are there any tariffs? And if so, what are they? Are they consistent or per export or whatever commodity? And secondly, what percentage of total trade, if known, is actually informal? That is not going through customs channel, if you understand what I mean, because that's significant in terms of motivation, of course, for vested interest to maximize profits.
True. So in terms of tariffs, pretty much negligible because you have the Atiga and all that. In terms of informal trade, yes, a lot happens. Basically, it's border trade. In some countries, for example, in the case of Thailand and Myanmar, a lot takes place. In Cambodia, a lot takes place. Even in Malaysia, Sabah, Philippines, a lot of such border trade takes place, largely because they have a lot of cultural affinity. Geographically, the borders are porous, and a whole bunch of different reasons. But these are usually, it's reducing, but it's not reducing probably fast enough. Yeah, so it is real. That border trade is very real.
I think also you were asking in terms of the percentage. I think there's no data on
No,
that.
there's no data. There's absolutely no data by virtue of it. It just gets exchanged and all that.
Yeah. And we are also just add, I think through our research, we also met with a lot of MSME businesses that quite frankly said that they are trading in informal sector. And a lot of it is also because I think the cost of doing formal trade is quite high for them, and they do trade within very small quantities. So it's a bit difficult for them to get into formal trade, and I think that is also included in our report as well. And Dr. Tina.
Yeah, I mean, 'cause, yeah, in Thailand, a lot of informal trades, but even by big corporations, are done, and it's very cultural because in Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar, not so much Cambodia now because we have some issues, but they for food from large corporation, they kind of value that it's coming from Thailand. Like there's some kind of increased trust that it's made in Thailand or produced in Thailand and then sent out. So they would look for that label before. I mean, Laos still, but yeah. So then they trade through these informal routes. This has to ask the companies. Yeah, I'm not sure why, but yeah, yeah, yeah. I didn't ask why.
Okay. Okay. I think maybe we can move on to the next question. The gentleman in blue, I think he raised his hand earlier, and then we can come to.
Okay, it's turned on. Okay, on the topic of database management, in Malaysia we've had issues with public skepticism of the PADU database and the Budi 95 registration process. Are there any case studies of similar issues with other ASEAN nations' own rollouts of these databases for subsidies, targeted aid, or general data gathering?
It's a very specific question. We can take the other question first. Yeah.
This is for Dr. Tina. Well, my hope is a bit dashed listening to Dr. Jai and Prof because of the not harmonizing. Because we were hoping for an ASEAN nation. I mean, only to me, only through that then the rest follows, particularly of the economic endeavor for the people of ASEAN. So, Dr. Tina, I don't know about the other ASEAN countries, but in Malaysia, the layman is a bit detached about ASEAN. I know only recently when they see it on the television, and that's about all. I had the opportunity to ask some ASEAN diplomats. And as I asked, why or how does it relate to the people of ASEAN? What do you do, in ASEAN, all those meetings and etc. And she said that, basically we just brush shoulders. I don't know whether that's authentic or not. But presently, how does the people of ASEAN communicate with each other so that there is some kind of we call this connection that would produce other strings of benefits to the people of ASEAN. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions that we can collect the questions as well? There are more questions. Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Lee. First of all, foremost, let me thank IDEA for this opportunity to listen to the distinguished panelists here. I think we have heard quite a number of points that were raised, but coming from me, having represented the trade, FMM before, in the international trade, and having the privilege of coming from multinational companies throughout, I think one of the greatest challenge, if I may also get the views from the panelists, is that we all realize that acknowledge that regulation is important. But sometimes at the ground level, the minute you travel a lot, as far as I'm concerned, I think the greatest advantage to any exporter or manufacturer, it's the physical presence in the market that you have targeted, right? Your visibility and noise level is so critical. And that comes to my point that I think the government should continue, particularly MIDA, Martrade. I appreciate Martrade's support during the course of my active business life, some of the small companies feel that they are too small to reach out for assistance from people like that. But trust me, I have walked into Martrade office in different countries, and not once I have been turned down. And the little pressure you put on them, it helps a lot. It gives you a lot of feedback. Who are the significant players? Because until and unless we can get together to share the expertise, one small micro and SMEs doesn't have that kind of international marketing strength, right? They just don't have the expertise and resources. So if we can share, we have many sectors involved here. Now, coming back to the regulation, Prof, you raised a very good point. I'm an advocate of standards, but unduly regulated. I want to emphasize on the word. If it's unduly regulated, it becomes choke points for the smaller companies. And cost is so coming back, the main point I want to highlight here is that since we have Martrade representative here, provide more incentives for the micro players, right? I think that will go a long way. Thank you so much for this opportunity to share.
Thank you. Do you want to just comment on the last part? It was less of a question, I think more of a statement.
Thank you for the kind words. We'll be happy to assist and continue to assist. In regards to the funding, I think if you look at the current budget, a lot of work has been scaled down in certain areas. The greater emphasis now, I think, in terms of rolling out government services is to provide greater level of service to make sure that that human intervention becomes critical, like in the case of Martrade. So maybe perhaps will be less grants moving forward. I think that's where the government is moving, but a lot more emphasis on the service provision. So hopefully we'll be able to continue assisting. Thank you.
Okay, and you go back to the two questions earlier. I think the first question was on data management. I think a bit of context for Dr. Tina, because there was a Malaysian example, I think, about our local database management system that had a lot of hiccups. But maybe from your perspective from Thailand, if there are any similar issues as well.
I mean, okay, first of all, most MSMEs don't have data, right? I just go to the basic. They don't even keep paper records, okay? I'm sorry, but that's the reality. And if you at the farm level, they don't keep, and they push it off to the middleman to handle it, right? And but if they do have data, they also have no skills of managing it. Because I can tell you, even big corporations, they have to outsource this skill as well. So it is also part of the process that we are training people to manage data and understand what are the valuable data that you should be looking at, like basic ROIs, return on your marketing, these kind of things that most companies will never even look at. They don't even think about, right? But interestingly, I at the FinTech event yesterday, there's a system that you don't have to actually know how to manipulate data using SQLs. You can just have your database. And even with missing variables, they can develop augmented data points. And you can just ask the question like, hey, how am I doing on my return on this spending? And it will generate the data to show you, right? So then the next step is, okay, we teach people how to collect data, and we can provide this tool that they can just license. Because if it's SMS, like there's millions, right? We can license at low cost, and the company can still continue to develop their software. But do we need to go there yet? I'm not sure. I think the first step is developing databases that is secure. There are lots of ways to secure data through, authentication factors and things like this. But maybe the first step is have the database and utilize it, because most people collect data that they don't use, and a majority collect data that they don't utilize, and they don't protect the data. Yes, it happens a lot, and a lot of hacking. It's unfortunate, but yeah, so that's probably is the first thing. It's also more training, right? Like teaching the skills which can be done in a community or association or part of the capabilities, right? So that's that. And the second question was?
Yeah, the second question was in terms of awareness of ASEAN, and I think also in terms of communicating that, I think, across the ASEAN member states.
So I studied at the Asian Institute of Technology. I don't know if you know it, but basically it's an institute where everyone goes and study. It's not for Thai people in particular. We have all the ASEAN countries there studying, researching, because it's a research institute. And this is where we share and get ideas. How is it done in this country? How is it done in this country? And we learn from each other, and we explore opportunities. I will say that it's not enough, obviously, because it's, postgraduate education, PhD, all the people working in policy mostly. So then the next step, I would say, is the relationship building between the new generation, right? Having communities of this university and that university hanging out with each other, developing some kind of association, like even just a marketing association on different campuses around the university, where the students have one conference where they can actually meet and become friends and discuss. And this happens like everywhere around the world, and we can create that too, right? And what I love about marketing association is that they just learn marketing, some marketing skills, but it can be applied in any industry and at every level of the industry, including MSMEs, something like this, right? And if we can develop this similar kind of idea, or it can be like a sustainable conference for young people, and they meet and network, and we build a community to connect people, right? So in the end, over time, maybe they become an innovator. They go to that event. Oh, I met you in, so we can share ideas and experiences and things more like that. So normally this is how we can build connection to different parts of the world, because not everyone has access to be fly there to visit every country in ASEAN, right? So if we can get everyone to come hang out in, Malaysia for this conference, right? So then we can meet each other and be friends. So this is maybe because I'm from university perspective, so I think this way.
Thank you. I think you're running out of time a bit, so I think I'll start winding up the discussion. We spoke a lot about digitalization today, I think, but also in the perspective of upgrading capabilities in terms of digitalization, and also in terms of sort of reducing the gap within value chains by plugging in MSMEs and the vertical integration of that. Maybe I'll just allow the speakers to sort of conclude and also share their final thoughts before we close the panel. Do you want to start with Professor? Yeah.
I probably would repeat what I said earlier. I think talking about inclusive trade and bringing MSMEs on board, including women entrepreneurs, not just MSMEs, I think the key point is to upgrade their capabilities. And that cannot be done in isolation. Upgrade their capabilities, help them to integrate vertically through supply chains, and also integrate digitally. I would think that these three things are important, and there are certain things that can only be done which are within our control. If I could just quickly about the standards, we can't stop, let's say if you trade with EU, the standards keep increasing and they're very stringent. NTMs keep increasing. So we can't control how non-tariff measures move, how measures increase. But what we can control is to reform. And I think domestic reform is very, very important in terms of procedural obstacles. If you have multiple regulators that you have to go to just to get an SPS certificate, that is going to cost business compliance costs for them. So we can do what is within our jurisdiction, that is to do domestic reform. And secondly, sometimes I think ASEAN, when you mentioned about communication, very quick one, my professor always told us in the 1980s, AFTA stands for agree first, talk after. I know some people get angry and I've been scolded in different platforms for this, but regionally it's hard to actually do. That's why today when we see multilateralism breaking down, everyone tries to actually use bilateral and smaller platforms where practical strategies are easier to push in terms of standards rather than regional. So I would think trade provisions do include MSMEs now. You can look at legal TINA database that will give you which are the trade provisions that are for MSMEs that are included in FTAs. So digital integration, upgrading, and a bit of domestic reforms.
And Dr. Tina?
I think the way we tend to think of progressing or making upgrades to our skills and capability is what benefit we are getting, right? But actually, we need to also look at the risk of not changing, right? So if we start to kind of show people like, oh, if you're not going to change, you're just going to die out, and then we need to make change together so we can, we invest our time, our effort together so we can grow together. So this is the thing. And the second part in relation, because I'm in the research side, not the policy, but when I get approached by representatives in the governments who are in charge of, making laws and rules and stuff, they have no idea what they should do. And it is like important that research and data is provided to the political powers so they know the right decisions to make and they have the information and the knowledge to back up their choices. Because if they make choices otherwise, we can hold them responsible for it, right? So these are like the two things that in terms of research, that's why it's important that we continue to, spend money on research and get data so we can make the right decisions in the scope that we are, working on. Yeah.
And never go against getting more money for research, I think. Maybe Mr. J? Yeah.
Thank you. I think as last words, what I want to emphasize is that intra-ASEAN trade has become very critical and acute. I think many the fellow panelists was mentioning how the relevance of it, and this is real. In the past, we did not have that sense of urgency, perhaps. So we were very outward looking. We went out all over the world looking for markets. But today it's happening here, and it's an easier win, relatively speaking. So if there is, again to reiterate, there is seriously genuine interest among all political leaders across ASEAN to make it happen. But the modalities and how you go about doing it is always a challenge. But once you have come to a point where you are extremely serious, or at least the MSMEs are serious, then I think it's already one step of a progress. ASEAN is very connected, literally now. You do literally also see Malaysians for the first time, studying in other parts of ASEAN. So there's human-to-human contact is taking place in a very significant way. That all should rightfully translate into, trade. There are committees now being set upon within ASEAN to really truly address NTBs. MRAs, for example, has been an utopian idea. It's been there, but never been able to do it. But I think there's greater level of urgency among everybody on the policy level as well as the companies. And if you're an exporter or you're a businessman, if you're not looking at ASEAN, then it doesn't make sense. But at the same time, there are challenges. There are also opportunities. I think today's this particular document is very beautifully addressed a key segment, the FMB segment, which is the backbone of ASEAN. As I was saying, many of the ASEAN countries, including Malaysia, we have food security issue, and today source it from rest of the world. So if greater sense of strategic projects are put in place to ensure that ASEAN as a whole is able to benefit from each other's strength and resources, then it will be prosperity across the region.
Thank you so much. I think a lot of insights shared today. I hope the audience as well found it very useful. Thank you so much for staying on, and thank you to the speakers as well. Testing.
Thank you, Sharmila, and all the panelists for a very insightful discussion. Please remain on stage for a photo session. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like now to invite Dr. Stuart Nixon, Deputy Director of Research at Ideas Malaysia, to deliver the closing remark. Please welcome Dr. Stuart Nixon.
All right. Here we go with this. Maybe I have to hunch a bit. Perhaps this is a metaphor for the barriers that small businesses face in the region, and also the resilience of everyone to navigate some of the technical challenges we have. I'll be brief. Two things I'm here to do. One, of course, is to thank the team, and the second is to provide some assorted closing remarks. It takes a lot to put any report together. Behind the scenes, of course, a whole bunch of people, and you'll see many of them around the room. I won't name all names, but I will call out all the authors. So Shamila, of course, you've seen. Priya, as our MC, is one of the co-authors as well. Nimitra at the back there. And in absence, Amir Najmi, who is a former team member of ours. Prof. Evelyn has been part of the team, broader team, as a wise old hand in this space, and a source of amazing information and connections. Tantri, as well, as a board member for Ideas, always supporting our trade and regional agenda. So thank you all. Thank you also to SJ and to Tina and Evelyn, of course, in terms of providing your comments today, many assorted observations, and I'm sure everyone got a lot out of that. And of course, I'd like to thank F&F, the Friedrich Neumann Foundation, for their long and sustained support. Kavalan, nice to see you here as well, and to Moritz back in Bangkok. This is the 10th API report, and it goes to the sustained partnership we've had. And I also owe F&F about 5 products before the end of the year. So that also goes to the breadth and depth of the partnership we have. In terms of my thoughts, so we've heard a lot today that trade is about people, and I'm biased as a migration scholar myself, but I mean, Tina spoke about people wanting to trade with families and communities and friends and things like that. SJ talked about the human aspects of borders and supporting MSMEs. MSMEs exemplify that trade is about people and the connectivity between people. And while the report doesn't go into depth on that issue, that is something that goes to opportunities in the ASEAN community. And at a time when countries seem to trust each other less and less, it's businesses and migrants that must forge clearer bonds and carve out their own livelihoods. That's not to say that policymakers should be excused in this, or that they're not doing good things. It was, of course, uplifting to hear the story that audience member Lee over here kind of mentioned in terms of the support Martrade had provided. Actually takes me back to our visit to Bangkok as part of this research. And what struck me and in a way disappointed me was just how small Martrade's presence in Thailand is. And for neighbouring countries, that just seemed a bit strange to me and a bit off-putting, and perhaps symbolises the untapped sort of opportunities to build that relationship. So there are opportunities for policymakers to do better, because while in my mind at least trade will go on with or without them, we talked about informal trade, it's the people of the region that lose out under that model. They lose out because there's higher compliance burdens, as we've heard, they miss out on engaging in additional opportunities that might be facilitated through deregulation or clearer procedures. But they also take on greater risks of informality, and I think that goes to further answering one of the questions from the audience. And it's MSMEs that are at the heart of that discussion. They're the ones that lose out the most, and our report today emphasises that. And at a time when the world and economic policy making are more uncertain, profoundly uncertain than ever, I think doubling down on the deep and trusted partnerships within the region is just essential. It's not a time for Malaysia, it's not a time for other countries in the region to be acting in what they perceive to be their own self-interest, but to reinforce and grow the connectivity within the region. Free trade has its critics, including those that make legitimate concerns around the distribution of the benefits. But open trade, supported by facilitative and fair regulations and procedures, remains a critical and highly beneficial force for economic development. Today's launch highlights inclusivity for MSMEs as a significant and legitimate distributional concern, advancing both fairer and freer trade through various recommendations that you can all see in the report online. Taking forward an agenda to harmonise and streamline standards across the region, it has to be ASEAN-led if it wants to remain or retain an economic development emphasis. Everyone present here today would be aware of the forces going on in the trade space in the world, the powerful recidivist forces coming out of Washington, trying to reshape the global trade order in its image. But this is an image of profiting from power, of asymmetric relations, both between countries and within countries in terms of income distributions. It's voodoo economics, and it's containing the rise of developing economies. We in the Ideas team heard way too many stories, though, within the region on barriers that don't apply to other markets, or that erode regional competitiveness against global markets. Perishability has been spoken about today, and that would appear at least to be a more enlivened concern within the region between neighbours than for far-flung markets that would seem logistically harder to get to, highlights the impediments or the barriers to future trade opportunities. But also, there is the space to grow more, a lot more, particularly for F&B trade. So many food and beverage categories, we spoke to people, are just simply not economical in the region because they are too perishable, and the potential barriers, the delays to logistics, scaling issues in terms of container freight, lack of cold chain infrastructure or traceability, and too much power vested in certain border officials are all potential constraints on that. But like the perishability of regional trade, I don't want you all to perish because I'm keeping you from lunch. So I will stop there. I want to thank everyone everyone else for being here. It is, as I say, at these events, ideas research and events are the start of a conversation. They're not the end of a conversation or an end of a process of advocacy. So hopefully many more conversations will be started today, including over lunch and hopefully in the days and weeks ahead. So thank you, everyone.
Testing. Thank you, Dr. Stuart Nixon, for the wonderful closing. To all our guests, you may download the report at ideas.org.my or scan the QR code to view the report. Ladies and gentlemen, today's event is coming to an end. Before that, let's all have a final photo session. Everyone, please stand in the middle of the ballroom for a photo session.